The New Orleans Saints got some good news on Monday with the return of several key players, especially along the offensive line, which is huge considering all of the injury news around Trevor Penning. We'll break all that down and give you a little bit of land yap on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. It's simple. You pick 2 to 5 players, and whether or not they're going to produce more or less than their Prize Picks projections, and then from that, you can win up to 10 times your money back from your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% deposit match up to $100. Just use promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, I want to give you all the things that you need to know from New Orleans Saints practice on Monday, including some big names that were back and some big names that were not yet back. And we'll also break down what the New Orleans Saints are going to do at 3 of the most complicated positions that they'll have to make selections from in terms of their 53-man roster. That deadline, of course, is 3 p.m. Central Time on Tuesday. So kick us off. Let's start off here with the return of some key names for the New Orleans Saints at practice, and one of them in particular could not have happened at a better time. In fact, 2 of them in particular could not have happened at a better time. So we'll start off with the New Orleans Saints getting a bunch of big names back, not the least of which being offensive tackle and left tackle James Hurst. James Hurst, a projected starter at left tackle at the beginning of the season here in just a couple of weeks against the Atlanta Falcons on September 11th, was back at practice on Monday. Now, remember, all that we get to see during these sort of open media viewing windows over the course of the regular season are, walkthroughs, maybe some individual drills, and stretch, right? We don't get to see team drills. We don't get to see a bunch of stuff like that. But James Hurst was present, and that's huge for the New Orleans Saints, as Trevor Penning, of course, is dealing with what Dennis Allen called a significant toe injury, which he suffered against the Los Angeles Chargers on Friday. They know that he needs surgery, but they'll have to wait to see how the surgery takes before they decide what they're going to do with him long-term throughout the season. And a pretty good indicator is that 3 p.m. Central Time Tuesday deadline, where New Orleans Saints and the rest of the NFL have to be down to 53 players on their roster. If the New Orleans Saints have Trevor Penning on their initial roster and then move him to injured reserve, then that means that they might have the opportunity to bring him back later on in the season. They would have to have him out for at least 4 games, but could potentially bring him back later than that. If they move him to injured reserve before that 3 p.m. deadline, however, Trevor Penning's season would be over. So in any case, it's great for the New Orleans Saints to have their projected starter in James Hurst back and with the team, getting ready for that September 11th matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Not only was James Hurst back, but so too was versatile offensive lineman, Landon Young, who the New Orleans Saints drafted just a couple of years ago. He was a career left tackle in the SEC at Kentucky. That's pretty good pedigree for you there, but has been working mostly at right tackle for the New Orleans Saints. But overall, they want him to be able to learn and play both of those positions. So having that depth behind James Hurst is huge for the New Orleans Saints. Now, they could still go to the free agency market. They could still go to the trade market in the attempt to find more experienced depth at left tackle, which certainly would have value, depending upon what the actual timeline will be for Trevor Penning. But at least the New Orleans Saints are in a situation where they have a starter and they have a backup. So they're in a good place there. We'll see if they decide to address the position any further over the course of the offseason as things continue to go along. And of course, as more players are cut from other teams. Over 800 players being cut over the course of these next few days. Now, over 500 of them will make practice squads, but still pretty big opportunity there for the New Orleans Saints to potentially find somebody that ends up getting cut loose from somewhere or another. The Saints also saw big returns on the defensive side with Alontae Taylor, as well as Pete Werner, the linebacker, who has missed the majority of practices over the course of this offseason, dealing with a groin injury. Started him a little bit late, then he came back for a few practices and then was out up until here very recently. Now, Alontae Taylor, we knew would be back. We saw that he was dressed during the Los Angeles Chargers preseason game, but still good to see him back after dealing with a hip flexor injury over the course of the off season. So good to see the two defenders back. Those are two players that you expect to not only make the roster, of course, when it comes to 53-man roster, but in both cases play at least a very pivotal role when it comes to Pete Werner, but at least have some type of an impact in 2022 when it comes to Alontae Taylor, whether that be via special teams or over on the defensive side. Saints also welcome back two of their tight ends, Adam Trautman and Taysom Hill, both of which were present at Monday's practice as well. So that's huge news for the New Orleans Saints to be getting all of those pieces back, particularly in the offensive line, particularly at linebacker, and then, of course, really at tight end as well, because the New Orleans Saints love their tight end position, and you kind of got a little bit curious when you didn't see Taysom Hill active in participating in that Friday matchup against the Chargers, but maybe the New Orleans Saints were just being pretty cautious with him. Adam Trautman had been missing for quite a while over the course of that last week of training camp practices, so good to see both of them back, number 7 and number 82, for their team. Chase Hansen, number 40, in case you're wondering in terms of linebacker depth, was also back. Saints are going to have some big decisions to make at linebacker as well as at running back and wide receiver. We're going to break down those three positions a little bit later on today, but first, we want to talk to you a little bit more about the absences from today's practice, the key one being Michael Thomas. Should you expect to see him week 1? I'll tell you why you shouldn't panic, at least not yet. But before we get to that here on Locked On Saints, I want to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. This is absolutely my favorite way to play daily fantasy football because you're not playing against other people. You're not playing against a group of other teams. You're not playing against spreadsheet wizards and all these other things. You're simply choosing 2 to 5 players, and then you look at their projections and pick whether or not they're going to be over or under that total. Will they make more or less than that projection? If you get it right, you can win some money. If you get all of them right, you get a big bonus. You can also choose a different way to do it so that you can get a couple wrong, but then still end up walking away with a payout. That's how Prize Picks ends up giving you more and more winnings than anybody else that's out there. So really, really cool stuff here coming from Prize Picks. So you can also do season stuff. Do you think that Jameis Winston, for instance, is going to throw for more than 3,750 yards? Or maybe you think he's going to throw for less. You can predict that over at Prize Picks, and by the end of the season, walk away with a little bit of cash if you got it right. Same thing for Michael Thomas. His Prize Picks projection right now is 800.5 yards. I will happily take more when it comes to that. You can check out more around the New Orleans Saints, MLB, NBA, women's basketball, women's college basketball, college football on the way. So many different ways that you can get involved over at Prize Picks today. So don't wait. Go and check them out today over at prizepicks.com or download the Prize Picks app today so you can get started and play daily fantasy sports. First time users are going to be able to get a 100% deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. So you put in $100, Prize Picks will match $100. You put $50, Prize Picks will match $50, and they'll give you $50 on top of that. So don't forget to enter that promo code Locked On at sign up for that instant deposit match of up to $100 at prizepicks.com. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we've got the Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 on the way. More than 50 Locked On local experts, Matt Williamson of Peacock and Williamson, and Lee Sterling of Locked On Bets, giving you everything that you need to know around the 2022 NFL season, going division by division. It all kicks off August 31st. Okay. So now for the New Orleans Saints, they had the good news of James Hurst being present and Landon Young being present, the tight ends being back, Pete Werner being there, Chase Hansen being there. However, they didn't get the good news that you had hoped for number 13 and Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas was not back at practice on Monday, at least not during the portion of practice that was open for media. I stress that because sometimes players are there and sometimes players aren't when we're around, but then they're there later, right? Things like that can happen, but we didn't see Michael Thomas out there. We also didn't see Paulson Adebo out there either. Paulson Adebo ended up leaving practice just a few days ago and has really been missing ever since then. You'll realize he didn't really participate at all in the Chargers preseason game either. So those are two big players, big positions, premier positions that make or break your season sometimes, as we saw with the cornerback spot in previous years in New Orleans pre-2017. And of course, the wide receiver spot just last year where the New Orleans Saints had to go without really Michael Thomas or any starting caliber wide receivers for an extensive and long enough time. You missed Marquez Callaway for some time. You missed, or was inconsistent for some time. You missed Deontay Hardy for 3 games, all of that. So for the Saints, those two players not being there is pretty significant. But you should remember, too, that there's extra time now between preseason and the regular season because of the 17th game. So since the preseason went from 4 games to 3 games, the NFL didn't get rid of that 4th game week. There's just 2 weeks in between the preseason game 3 to wrap it all up and the regular season. So it's kind of like a little bit of a bye week in a way. So I wouldn't be too concerned just yet. So the question that I get all the time is, will Michael Thomas be available week 1? As of right now, I would say this about Michael Thomas and about Paulson and Adebo. Neither are there any indicators in either case that neither will be available or that one or the other won't be available to start the 2022 season on September 11th against the Atlanta Falcons. That can change, obviously, but as of right now, there's no indication that that would be the case. You'll notice that Michael Thomas was present for Demario Davis's tryouts for the 7-on-7 league that he's a big part of. And so that's a little bit of a sign for you that Michael Thomas might actually just be in a situation where he's being sort of monitored or being sort of, ramped up is kind of the big buzzword or buzz phrase of the 2022 New Orleans Saints offseason, including sooner rather than later, right? Same thing could be happening with Paulson and Adebo. Again, that's a very important position for the New Orleans Saints. Now, they have good depth there, just like they have good depth at wide receiver now with Jarvis Landry and Chris Olave. You've got good depth there at corner now with guys like Alontae Taylor and Bradley Roby. I think eventually Quentin Meeks will be back, who was cut a few days ago. I think he'll be back on the practice squad, but I think he'll eventually be back. But the fact that they were willing to move on from both Quentin Meeks and Brian Allen this weekend tells you it gives you a little bit of a positive sign around Paulson and Adebo, I'll say it that way, right? So I wouldn't be too concerned just yet. If they're not there next week, then that becomes a big issue. But remember, the first injury report doesn't go out until I believe it's Wednesday of next week. So until that point, there's not really any reason for the New Orleans Saints to A, tell you what's going on injury-wise, and B, do anything other than what their plans are. I got a great question the other day from the live show that I did Monday morning around the New Orleans Saints and, ahead of practice about Matt Rhea. And hey, I thought that with Matt Rhea being around, the Saints weren't supposed to have that many injuries. Well, one person doesn't make all that much difference. But what you'll notice is that the injuries that we're discussing are ones that maybe aren't that serious, but that are being cared for as opposed to things being rushed. And in the past, that's been a problem here in New Orleans, to where injuries have happened and players have been rushed because you at 85% is better than any other receiver or better than any other better than any other linebacker or whatever at 100%, right? That doesn't seem to be the mentality of the New Orleans Saints anymore. And also the New Orleans Saints with Matt Rhea, he focuses and has done great work on soft tissue injuries. So things like a significant toe injury that was effectively turf toe, that's not a soft tissue injury, that's an impact injury. Broken arms, broken collarbones, broken shoulders, things like that. Those are impact injuries. Those are not soft tissue injuries. But what you're seeing with players being held out of practice, with players not playing through or fighting through injury, and players actually getting a substantial amount of time between when they're injured and when they're seen again, that is Matt Rhea in effect. It's not necessarily that he's going to stop the injuries from happening, but he's going to stop the injuries from getting worse and progressing. And that's a big, big shift for this New Orleans Saints medical staff, which has dealt with those issues in the past. So Matt Rhea already showing you the positive impact that he has. Even if that means that those players aren't getting out on the practice field when we're around, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It means that they're being taken care of and that things are being addressed as they pop up, as opposed to waiting for things to potentially get worse and to the point where you potentially can't fight them any longer. So for me, the positive impact around Matt Rhea is exactly what we're seeing. Okay, coming up next, what are the New Orleans Saints going to do at wide receiver, at running back, at linebacker? There's a lot of questions around those particular spots. I'll tell you what I think they're going to do based upon what we've seen over the course of the offseason so far. We got that coming up for you as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Before we get to that, are you one of those people who thinks that it's okay to drive under the influence, to drive stoned? Maybe you know somebody like that will ask questions like, what's the worst that can happen? The worst is that you end up getting, driving below the speed limit, for instance. It's no big deal, right? Wrong. It's a huge deal. The truth is that your reaction times slow down when you're high, when you're impaired, and when you're under the influence. You're not only putting yourself in danger, but you're endangering the people around you as well. Like, you could change the course of someone else's life or potentially end someone else's life and therefore changing the course of your own life. So stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, don't get behind the wheel. That's it. Just don't get behind the wheel. If you feel different, you drive different. Drive high, get a DUI. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with the three most sort of contentious roster, let's just say rooms, I guess, depth charts in the along that New Orleans Saints roster, and that will include wide receiver, linebacker, and running back. Now, running back has already taken shape, right? Dwayne Washington, Tony Jones Jr., both present at practice on Tuesday. Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram are absolutely locked in. The Saints moved away when it came to Abram Smith, but can Sony Michel end up re-entering the chat? He's just recently been let go by the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Saints will have to select their initial 53-man roster first before they can go out there and do anything. Like waiver awards won't happen until like noon Eastern time on Wednesday at this point. So no matter what, they kind of have to do the 53-man roster and then maybe add a running back after that. But it's not impossible. There's a few players out there that are worth watching for the New Orleans Saints, and that's definitely one. Jared Davis, the linebacker, is another one. Ty McGill is another one, the defensive tackle. So there's a lot of different ways that the New Orleans Saints can go, particularly though starting with that running back spot. Are they settled there, or are there still more potential moves to come? I think based upon the fact that they tried Sony Michel out earlier on and reportedly tried to sign him early on in the offseason, that there's no reason for the New Orleans Saints not to be interested in him anymore, even though you might feel a little bit more like Alvin Kamara's suspension isn't going to kick in 2022, that might take until 2023. If you can get a guy like Sony Michel in August, September, you go and get a guy like Sony Michel in August or September. That's a potential starting running back on most rosters around the NFL. New Orleans Saints will be able to take advantage of that talent when it comes to depth, and then maybe keep a Dwayne Washington or keep a Tony Jones Jr. as an additional special teamer. But I don't think it stops at running back. There's some big questions to answer on the offensive side when it comes to wide receiver as well. Traequan Smith, unfortunately, dealt with an injury, one that didn't look great on Friday against the Los Angeles Chargers when he tried to make that diving catch that turned into the big circus catch that should have been a touchdown for Marquez Callaway. But of course, premature whistles, New Orleans, the NFL referees, we get it. So is Traequan Smith dealing with enough of an injury that it ends up keeping him either on the roster to begin with and then going to injured reserve? Do we see his season come to an end before it starts? Or do we see the New Orleans Saints simply say, hey, he's actually fine, but we don't have room for him on the roster? Because that could be the case based upon the other 5 receivers that you already kind of know you're keeping in Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, Chris Olave, Deontay Hardy, and Marquez Callaway. After that, are you going to keep a 6 wide receiver? And under what circumstance would you then keep Traequan Smith over Kirk Merritt, knowing all the different ways that Kirk Merritt can contribute to you? Is Traequan Smith's value as a blocker greater than that of Marquez Callaway, which then makes you keep Traequan Smith around as a 6 wide receiver, as opposed to saying, okay, we feel good about what Marquez Callaway gives us in that area of the game, as well as Jarvis Landry, as well as Michael Thomas, which remember, that's a big difference now. You've got 3 of those guys that are solid blockers on the perimeter, unlike last year where your 1 was basically Traequan Smith and then Marquez Callaway was learning the ropes there. So do you have enough talent in terms of blocking wide receivers that you don't have the reason to keep Traequan Smith around anymore available to you? And does that open the door for a Kirk Merritt who looks to be back with the wide receivers all of a sudden? So what does that mean? So there's some, get the Hurst meme, y'all. What does it mean? What does it all mean? So it's worth watching. It's worth watching there for sure. The final one is going to be linebacker. And this I think is tricky, right? Like for me, you take the veteran experience over anything else because you're dealing with injuries with your starters. So you go with the veteran experience and depth. And so you've got Demario Davis, Pete Werner, Caden Ellis. They're locked into the roster, I think. So then the next piece is finding the depth. And I think you go Eric Wilson, John Bostic, and then you go with either Chase Hansen or maybe Andrew Dowell, guys that maybe aren't veterans in the way that Eric Wilson and John Bostic are veterans in that they have starting experience in the NFL and all that, but guys that know the system in New Orleans because they've been here for multiple years on different occasions, right? So I think that guys like Chase Hansen and Andrew Dowell make more sense than a guy like Nephi Sewell, who popped on the scene the last week of camp. And those astronomical rises at the end of camp aren't usually the guys that you get excited about. You get excited instead about the guys that showed out throughout the entirety of camp, like Kirk Merritt, who would have been a camp superstar from the very beginning because of the catches that he was making at wide receiver, were it not for big stories like Michael Thomas and Tyrann Mathieu and Jarvis Landry dominating the landscape. Deservedly so, right? Those are the ones that were supposed to dominate the landscape. But we probably would have talked about Kirk Merritt a little bit more if he would have come on to, let's say, a less interesting team. But fortunately for us, the New Orleans Saints are endlessly interesting. So when you look at what this New Orleans Saints roster looks like now at wide receiver, running back, and linebacker, you're looking at depth across all of these spots and who can provide the most depth for you. That's one of the reasons why I kind of put Kirk Merritt above Traequan Smith in that wide receiver conversation, because he is one player that serves three different purposes. And all of a sudden, when you bring out 48 players on game day, as Dennis Allen likes to highlight, the guys that can provide the most are the guys that become the most valuable. And I think Kirk Merritt has made himself incredibly valuable to this team with his ability to be able to get some run at running back, get some run at wide receiver, help you on special teams, right? Similarly, over on the linebacker side, Andrew Dowell, special teams and linebacker. Chase Hansen, special teams and defense. You're getting that from those guys, right? Whereas Nephi Sewell, you've really only seen impact games a little bit from the linebacker spot, which I think helps him as a lock in terms of a practice squad guy that could potentially get elevated if they ever needed him to, and somebody that, becomes a reserve linebacker for you if you end up having some more need at that position. But right now, I think the veteran experience, veteran depth, and veteran versatility are more important to this team than the youth and inexperience when it comes to versatility. So that's my thoughts on linebacker, running back, and wide receiver. So for the New Orleans Saints, they have some big decisions to make leading into that 3 p.m. Central Time deadline where all NFL rosters need to be down to at least their initial 53. So expect a flurry of roster moves throughout the day on Tuesday to help them get there, and we will keep you up to date the entire way. We'll have another live show for you Tuesday morning. I'm going to be joining Scott Alexander over at WLAE TV in the morning for his evening broadcast. And then, of course, I'll be at practice on Tuesday afternoon with another show Tuesday night. So we're back to 2-a-days here at Locked On Saints. Start thinking about your questions. So I'm going to be bringing some of those back for the second episodes every day as well. I appreciate you, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you're seeing, make sure you hit that like button, turn on your notifications, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you find us on your podcast provider, this is your first time catching the show, thank you very much for coming here. And I hope that you stick around here throughout the rest of the 2022 NFL season, because things are only going to get more interesting, more intriguing, more exciting here in Louisiana. Got that coming up for you throughout the rest of the week. More Locked On Saints. For everything else that you're looking for, make sure you're also going and checking out for your second listen today, Locked On Fantasy Football. Over 20 years of fantasy football experience, Vinny Iyer is giving you everything you need to know to make sure that you're able to dominate your fantasy football leagues. Find it wherever you're getting this podcast as your second listen today. As always, y'all, I appreciate you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. And of course, if you see me, say hi. As always, if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.